Welcome to the Total Innovation Podcast, where we explore the people, principles, and practices driving real-world innovation today. I'm your host, as always, Simon Hill. And in today's episode, we're diving into a topic that sparks debate amongst many innovators and innovation teams around the world. The question is, can, or maybe should, innovation be systematized? Should it be a profession? If it is a profession, are we in danger of turning something innately creative and exploratory into a box-ticking exercise, or even worse? To head this big, bold question, I'm joined today by Victoria Milne, the UK Head of Delegation for ISO Innovation Standards, a driving force behind ISO56001 and the founder of Verity Merit. Victoria is an accomplished innovation management consultant, trainer, and thought leader. She's helped shape innovation ecosystems and strategies across industries as diverse as fintech to mining, led government-backed research, and worked with top institutions like Imperial College and BSI, the British Standards Institute. Amongst many different projects, she's working currently alongside me and a number of others on an accreditation pathway for innovation professionals. Think a Chartered Institute for Innovation Management or something similar. If you care about making innovation more impactful, more intentional, then this is the episode for you. And with that, welcome to the podcast, Victoria.
Oh, thank you, Simon. It's so lovely to join you today.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one. As I said, I think this topic of systematizing innovation and, is it a profession? Is it a process? Is it a pipe dream? Hopefully not, is a good one to dig into. And I know that you've spent quite a bit of the last few years, and maybe more than that, working on this and agonizing about it. So I'm excited to have this conversation. Maybe I give a quick introduction, but why don't you just quickly just set the scene for folk, and it's always nice to introduce yourself as well as to be introduced.
Well, I got involved in standards writing actually through my industrial design background, and joined the committee at BSI, and then was asked to join the ISO committee that's responsible for writing innovation management system standards. And that all began because there was a request from the European network to develop a standard that helped to determine whether grants and public funding that was given to organizations to innovate was being given to the right organizations. And so that's really where this all started out, to say, how can we tell if an organization is going to be innovative, as opposed to whether or not they had a one-hit wonder, one great idea, so that funding was being given to them not for incremental growth, but for exponential growth, because that's what you want to see when you give grants to organizations for innovation, that they take that and they run with it. It doesn't just help them to get over one hurdle, but it actually clears the way for them to grow and to improve on productivity. So that's where this all started out. But it did make us stop and ask the question to say, well, can you do this? Can you have a systems approach to innovation? Should you even have this? So it's taken about 15 years and a lot of international debate and conversation, a whole host of experts really questioning ourselves and questioning whether this was the right thing to do and what it needed to encompass in order to be successful. So that's a little bit of the background that I've been involved in a lot of these debates and conversations about what innovation management is and what systems-based innovation management should be. And having a design background and understanding the design methodology and the approaches, the human-centered approaches, design-led thinking, how that can inform an innovation management process. And indeed, there's a process within that, and making sure that that's built into how organizations see innovation management. And so that for me has been kind of the key component that I always come back to make sure that we have a really robust process within the system.
So let's talk about that, right? And I think it's good to set that scene of and I know I've sat in some of these meetings, and others that we all know have sat in these meetings over a long period of time, right? And there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, a lot of, really really challenging all of the preconceptions, misconceptions. I think a lot of it even thought that hadn't necessarily been thought yet, right, as well. Or at least we hadn't sort of processed it in that way and suddenly had strong feelings about it of something that isn't, I think, inherently a system needs systematizing is quite complicated. So let's maybe start there. Like, what does systematizing innovation actually mean to you when people talk about it?
Well, I think the first thing is and I've always described it as, innovation it's within the standard, we talk about it being the innovations, the things that you produce. But innovating is a verb. It's a doing thing. And it shouldn't be something individual that you can point to in an organization. And, if we look back about 10, 20 years ago, if you asked any CEO about innovation, he'd point to, that we have an innovation lab. And that's where it happens. It happens in this room with, the foosball table and the fake grass and the bean bags. Like, that's innovation. If you see those things, those artifacts, that's where innovation takes place. And that's not what it's about. So this is quite a step change from some of the leading thinking around the 2000s that was coming out of America and American universities, saying that, oh no, innovation should kind of sit alongside the engine of the organization. But this is quite a step change from that. We're saying innovation should be systemic. So when we say systematizing, the first part of understanding that is that it is systemic. So just like, the famous story in NASA, if you ask the janitor who's sweeping the floor what he does, he helps put people on the moon. It's about a systemic approach to innovation where everybody within the organization understands their role and how they can contribute to innovating. It doesn't sit separately in, some hallowed space down the hall where people very rarely get to experience what it is and actually participate and take part in creating innovation for the organization. So that's the first aspect. And then the second aspect, so systemic is the first, systematic is the second. And this is about having clear processes and being able to measure and assess your processes and not simply allowing them to happen ad hoc and individually with criteria that aren't necessarily even explicit. Often we find that they're just simply implicit criteria that haven't actually been articulated and aligned to the strategic direction of the organization. So when it comes to systematizing innovation and innovation management, it's about systemic and systematic within the space.
I think that, and I like the language framing here. And I don't know if you know, but in an earlier podcast, we had Steve Rader on from NASA, who told a very similar story, but actually brought it all the way through the organization, even to the folk who you might think about as more obviously contributing to putting people on the moon or whatever, the rocket scientists and others, and getting them into the mind space of their job was to bring people back safely as well, right? And so it isn't about you being the subject matter expert and solving all the world's hallowed problems of doing that. It's about using the talents of the world, having a system, having an open approach, an open mindset, and using your strengths and skills to turn over every rock and follow the process to the most expansive form that it can be, to know that you did everything to bring those astronauts back safely from a mission, right, as well. And so I agree with you, and it sort of folds from that sort of anecdotal janitor level all the way through to identity and everything else. It feels like, and maybe it's because you and I are so in it, I don't know if the wider world feels like this, but this topic of systematizing innovation is finally starting to gather some traction. Is there a reason for that do you agree with me, first of all? I mean, probably yes, given the work that you're doing, but outside of maybe the bubble that you and I live in, do you feel like that's true in the wider innovation world? And if so, why might that be the case?
Part of a change that we're seeing in society, and you spoke there about subject matter experts, and we've allowed in the past these type of ivory towers of, the kind of master creator, the it's actually the great man theory, this singular creative individual who can completely come up with wonderful new ideas that are fully formed as great concepts and deploy them as solutions, without even trying. And we've realized and we've learned, and in fact the empirical evidence shows that's not true. It's been disproven that actually it's about the creativity, and the best ideas, the best results come from diverse groups, happy groups. So mood is one of the most important indicators of your likely success of your innovation. So happy groups of diverse teams. And that means that you can't have these ivory towers, these silos. Those don't work well. And I think social media is having a big role to play, and the kind of generational views that we're seeing, whether good or bad, that questions need to be asked about expertise, because often the expertise doesn't necessarily engage with what really is happening within an environment, within a space. And so a lot of assumptions are made. And that might be on a great amount of knowledge, but it's not necessarily the relevant and current knowledge. And so what's happening is we're saying the way we used to do things doesn't work for us. The way we used to produce innovation isn't producing innovation that's right for our environment, that it isn't innovation that's right for the majority of our society. It might be right for those who happen to hold shares within the organization, but it's not necessarily to the benefit of all within society. So there's a whole lot of questioning that's going on. We can see it in every realm of our lives. But when it comes to innovating for organizations, we're starting to say, how can we better leverage everybody within our organization? How can we better draw from all of the innate knowledge that we have? How can we better create solutions that are better sense checked? We talk about fail fast, but it's minimizing uncertainties sooner, so that we can produce faster and more successful innovations, product growth, market growth, and improve productivity and efficiency within the organization.
And so how do we balance that with, I'm going to throw a big question at you now around this, because you've got that sort of, that piece of, I guess, the innovator being, the Steve Jobs figure, the genius, which we all know wasn't really a truism, and certainly doesn't extrapolate out into at scale for in any meaningful way, even if there are ad hoc geniuses out there. Should this be a profession then, or does that create the ivory tower, right? That we're trying to dispel the myth of. So let's run with that question a bit. Like, so we're trying to professionalize it. Should we be, right? Should it be a profession? And if so, why?
So it's a very big question. Part of the issue that we have, and so there's part of the issue is that what's been happening up until now is we've tended to have organizations internally figure things out for themselves. So whether it's Apple's methodology or IBM's methodology or Unilever or Procter & Gamble's methodology, each of these organizations have internally figured it out themselves, how they're going to manage their innovation. And I really like using the fast-moving consumer goods industry as an example of innovators, because of the rate of what they push out, some new variants, new products, probably faster than any other category. And internally, it's organizational theory. The organization has been controlling that. And generally, they've had a bit of what we call constructivism. So an approach of learning where they've kind of figured it out, what works for them. And there's lovely narrative about how they've learned this process, and they have their own kind of naming of each of the steps, and it's their specifically owned process. This is all great, but what it does is it means that it then becomes trapped within that story. And it becomes quite difficult to be able to compare and kind of link and work with other organizations who have their own internal story, who've developed their own language when it comes to innovation and how that all works. So suddenly it sits in isolation, and it can be very good for that organization, but it can't actually expand beyond that. So it becomes, its strength becomes its greatest weakness because it cannot connect with anything else. And it can sometimes be quite difficult to understand. If you're external and you don't understand the language, it sounds like they're speaking in a foreign language because there's so much jargon and terminology that's only known to them. So the issue is, how can you then balance that with more of a kind of a bit more structure that's more universal? And it's getting that kind of institutionalism, which is kind of that outside in view, that macro view, to say, okay, can we even just agree what innovation means? There you go, like one definition. Can we all use the same definition for innovation? So we want to balance that institutionalism with the organization's own development, so that there's the ability for it to move from within the organization externally and work well with others, and expand that into open innovation, and expand that into their supply chain innovation, and all of these sorts of aspects, which is where you start to really see that growth of innovation result and impact. And then we also, there's a bit of a balance that you need to have with a bit of what's called behaviorism, which is kind of Pavlov's dog is the best example, where you make sure that there is also some structure involved. Because if we allow it to simply be this kind of, well, this is our story of how we create things, and it's very qualitative, and there's not enough metric and measurement internally to say, okay, well, is our innovation process doing better or worse this year than it did the previous year? Are we going to produce better quality innovations, or are we actually not improving on the quality year on year of what we're producing through our process? So not actually having kind of mechanisms to manage and assess and quantify then means that it's difficult to improve. What I can measure, I can then improve on. So it's these four factors. I know it sounds quite complicated, but there's these four factors involved. Now, why all of this is so relevant is because if we want to see this practice become formalized, and something where I can take somebody's experience from one organization and understand and situate it within another organization, it means that we create a much better flow of ideas and innovation resource and capability and capacity, both within organizations, but within markets as well. And that's where we're going to start to see the growth and productivity, because innovation affects growth and productivity. So why do we need to professionalize innovation management? So that we can best balance the internal culture, the organization, and the external structures of kind of formalizing a practice, as well as making sure that you have the right measurement and assessment, something that is both quantitative as well as qualitative in the way that it is learned and developed and owned by the individuals who are creating innovations in the organization. And to get that right, you do need to have some kind of formalized practice and understand, just as I've shared with you now, understand these elements and be able to work with these elements with a perspective to say, okay, as a systems architect, how do I get this right? And that's a really important job. And that job needs to be certified. That job needs to be done by somebody who has the right skills and competencies and the right capabilities, learning, knowledge to be able to do that effectively for both an organization as well as an ecosystem through to a national level, regional level, and at a global level.
Which is a big ambition. we're kind of at the early stages, which as I started exploring this with you and the teams around different parts of the world that are doing it, not many people get involved in building a profession. So maybe we can just talk about that a little, right? What does it mean to make innovation a recognized profession, and where are we on that journey, and what is there an analogous profession we can think of that maybe can bring that to life a little bit, that's been formed in a time frame that people can go, oh, I can see how that's, because it's a sort of sentence, right? We're going to professionalize innovation. What does it mean?
So, well, good examples are project management, as well as quality management. And we saw with both of those, as they became recognized professions, that they began with standards. So when we look at this, we expect to see some building blocks. And the first kind of building block is a standard, a management system standard that talks about what it is that practice does within an organization. And it helps us to also get some of those key definitions down. I think having that common language is the key. So a lot of what standards writing is actually saying, okay, what do we mean by innovation? And innovation is new and improved generation of value. So it's realizing value. So if it hasn't actually realized any value, it's still research, it's still experimentation, it's still, it's not yet innovation. No. Just so having that shared language, having the standard, and then from there, what we see, and what you would like to expect to see is the coming together of those practitioners who are leading this conversation, who are saying, let's start to codify what good looks like. With the standard tells us what we're in the business of, and now we're saying, what does good look like? So somebody going in, an individual going in and working and delivering on the standards requirements, what should they know? So what is the body of knowledge that they should have? What should they understand about, we've used terms like open innovation and ecosystems. What should they understand? What should they understand about systemic and systematic, in this process? So the body of knowledge coming together and determining what that is, having a very clear idea of, what the job levels are. So what is an assistant, innovation executive? What's an innovation manager's role? When we start to talk about, a VP of innovation, what do we expect? And all the way up as we go. A chief innovation officer, what would we expect their portfolio to look like? So understanding the job roles, but then having a house, an institution, a place where those who are new to the practice can come in and learn from others, a place where we can house our collective knowledge, create our own library of case studies, of all of the collective experience, and ways to share and learn, and then to recognize the level of proficiency that people have. So, have you got your practitioner's certificate? Have you got a management certificate, all the way up to eventually having chartered status. And so being able to get all of those building blocks in place, that's how we go about establishing a profession. And our job, our very important job, that we're doing right now, is making sure that we get that balance right. between that institutionalism and that organizational theory, between constructivism and behaviorism, it's like standing on a balance ball. You've got to get that just right, because if we go too far one way, then we're a big box ticking exercise and everybody becomes automatons, and the only kind of innovation we'll see is incremental. It'll be really boring.
Yeah.
It'll be safe stuff. And we'll see a lot of frustration.
Yeah.
If we err too much to the other side, we'll be back where we were before, where nobody can talk the same language. We've all been in those situations where you've got, a group of startups on one side of the room and a group of corporates on the other, and they even dress completely differently, and they can't even have a conversation, in a social environment, let alone in the work environment, because there's nothing that they have of consistency when it comes to their language and their processes and their systems. So it's making sure that we balance all of that, making sure that we don't err on one side or the other too much as we begin to professionalize innovation management, but have all of those kit of parts, like we've seen with quality management and project management.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting analogy as well. And one of the data points that was discussed in one of our meetings was, and that's not a data point that perhaps many will know, is it typically has taken about 15 years to go from that point of early concept of a profession to it being a profession. Like quality management took about 15 years, project management took about 15 years. So are we 15 years out, or 14 maybe, from this being a profession, do you think?
No, I think that we're moving a lot faster, and that's to do with AI, as well as using social media. The ability to bring people together now is significantly faster than it was 50 or 60 years ago, and getting feedback and being able to move a lot faster with these developments. So I don't think it's going to take us that long. We also have a bit of a catch up to do in the UK. So we see that some of the markets are a little bit further ahead of us as far as setting up associations and things like that. So there is a little bit of a race, if I can say that. I think it's quite good to have a bit of pressure, because that gets us to really focus on what we need to do. But also it's quite interesting to see that even looking across the world at the appetite for this professionalization. Some developed markets might be a little bit slower to take this up, but when I've recently been in Southern Africa and in places like that, where when we talk about this, there is such interest and there's such appetite for it. It's really very exciting to see that this isn't just happening here with our little group of experts who are in our own little kind of echo chamber. This is global, and there's a global appetite for this, and it is really an exciting time to be part of what's happening. It's the uptake on the standard as well. That's usually a really good indicator of how there is a demand and need, but at the rate of change. And so seeing organizations like the NHS already training and beginning to apply 56001 when it literally was published in September of last year is phenomenal. I don't think there's been uptake like that of any of the major management system standards. So one of the largest organizations in the world beginning to look at implementing 56001 is a huge,
Agreed.
huge
Agreed.
kind of outcome.
Yeah. And I do think that global perspective is kind of fascinating, actually. And the bits of the world that are jumping on this, it'll be interesting to watch that trajectory over the next little while as well. You've mentioned 56001 and listeners may not be super familiar with this. I suspect also there's a degree of I don't know, let's call it cynicism, maybe an eyebrow raised or something around the idea of ISO standard for innovation. So let's talk about that. Like what are these standards? Can you just introduce the concepts for people, and then maybe we'll get into why we should reserve some cynicism. I mean, we've spoken a little bit about it in this dialogue already, but once you get into the weeds of a standards document, and they're quite long. They're good, but they're quite long documents, right? Like, how do we make sure this doesn't become that sort of box ticking, reduced to compliance exercise that some of these ISO standards are?
Yeah, and that's so important, that it doesn't go that box ticking route, that we, that our balance ball that we fall over into that kind of, institutional behaviorism. That would be a disaster. So the 56,000, the suite. So it's a little bit like walking into your favorite bookshop and going into the management section and then finding the shelf that's on innovation management. And there's all the books that are there that have been published. And how ISO works is we have, they're kind of more like reports, but we have those that are requirements. So you have to meet these requirements and then you can get the certificate. And that's always the 1001. And so that's the requirement standard. But below that, you'll find 56,002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think we're about 13, 14, and 15 we're writing at the moment. So you'll find a whole lot of other kind of management self-help books around partnerships, around innovation management for IP. So how to handle your IP when it comes to innovation, how to work with partners, how to best assess your system, how to best measure your system, all of these individual guidances. So you don't get certified against them, but what it does is it gives you the best advice. And when I say it's the best advice, it is literally, like I say, about 4 years worth of usually anywhere between 80 to 100 experts who are on our committee working on that particular report, developing it, putting in best practice, refining it. So it really is best practice advice that you could possibly find on how to best assess or measure whatever aspect of innovation management that you're particularly interested in one of those guidances. And the first number, 56,000, that's our little dictionary. So that's going to have all of these words like, does innovation mean? What is innovation management? What is an innovation management system? And it describes what each one of those things are. And so what that's really all about is actually starting to say, as an innovation manager, you're not the manager of that particular piece of innovation as it moves through the organization, from the post-it notes all the way through, to the product sitting on the shelf or the service that it becomes or whatever it might be. That you are actually responsible for the management of the system that happens to be innovation, and understanding kind of that role. And that's really what the standards kind of, as an innovation management system standard, the whole suite really teaches you. It teaches you to kind of step back and say, well, I'm actually, maybe rather than calling me the innovation management, call me the innovation systems architect, because effectively that's my job, to be able to create this when I'm implementing the standards and putting them in place. So 56,001 is really kind of the requirements so that you can get the certification. But for the person doing the job in your organization, it is the kind of guidebook, the guardrails, the processes to be able to implement it. And to make sure it's not a box ticking exercise, to make sure we don't go over on our balance board, we've put in 8 principles. And the 8 principles are fundamental to how we've written the standards. So as a committee, we agreed the principles first. That was the hardest part for us in the 15 years that we've been working, is actually deciding on the 8 principles. And these are all about future-focused leaders who are brave and courageous, who actually support innovation. It's about having strategic alignment so that your innovation aligns to the strategy of the organization. It's about generating value. If your innovation is not generating value, you're not doing innovation. It's about having the right kind of culture. It's about having an adaptable structures so that you're agile and flexible in how you structure your teams so that you can actually get this innovation to market. It's all of these aspects that make it up. And of course, that systems approach. And that's the magic sauce that helps you. In fact, I would actually say that helps you define the center of our balance ball are the 8 principles. So you've got this whole wonderful structure, frameworks, all of that within 56001. That's your requirement standard. But fundamental to it, right in the center, sits the 8 principles, and that will help you always as your systems architect to balance, to say, have I got this right? Am I giving enough creative freedom where I need to? Have we got our process right so that we're not allowing things to run too long before we decide whether it needs to be maybe even be stopped as a piece of innovation, to know when to say no. All of those sorts of aspects you can then manage from that center point.
Yeah, I like that analogy. I just came back from a week's vacation, and there was a circus act one night where the person wasn't on one balance board. They were on about 12 different things on top of this thing balancing. I feel like that's what we're doing sometimes. But they made it, and so we can make it as well. As we kind of come towards the end of this, hopefully there's people sitting thinking, oh, this sounds great. And I do like the idea of a systems architect for this, right? Like, I have some philosophical challenges with the role of a chief innovation officer, because it's not really a chief role, in my opinion. Even if it is, it's not in organizations. But the people getting stuck in and making this, embedded and integrated and systematized, as you've spoken to, is the role, I think, right? From my perspective. But what if people want to find out more, or like, what advice would you give to people that are going, this sounds great. How can I? What is the level of effort to take home? Like, can I find out more? Like, what is it? Let's make it a bit real for people. What it might look like.
So, one of the things we did do is we made 56001 as short as possible. And this is one of those things where I really recommend that you get the standard, that you buy the standard, and give it a read, because it's one of those things. It's a lot of people think, oh, this is going to be onerous, this is going to be really heavy, but we've kept it super simple. We've designed it so that it can apply to a startup, a social enterprise, to anybody. And going back and reading it afresh myself, I'm like, this. You literally can read it within an hour. You can page through the whole thing and get a lot of value just in doing that. So I recommend that you do that. There's lots online about it. You can also pick up 56002, which is kind of a guidance for the whole of 56001. So if you want a little bit more meat on the bones, that's really a good one to kind of understand in a little bit more detail what we're really talking about with everything. But go to the source. If I'm honest, just go to the source, because it's not that complicated. And it's a really simple framework, that covers off leadership, planning, your kind of resourcing, your context, and then your process. And that's pretty much it. Along with those 8 principles, you can very quickly start to say, well, do we have these? Do we have the right kind of leadership? Do we have the right kind of culture? Do I have a systems approach to my innovation management? Oh, no, we haven't actually thought about it like that before. And you can immediately start to see where there are opportunities for yourselves, your own organization, where you can start to make improvements. And that's the best place to start, really.
No, I agree. I think there is still a listen and receive, or read and receive challenge in this. Back to that very sort of pejorative example of what does innovation mean. You can read the words on that 1,000 times and go, yeah, I get it. And then one day wake up on day 1001 and go, oh, I get it. Right. It's like there's a moment in that journey. And that's true against every little bit of that learning, in that it's not really, I think, what you're receiving sometimes, because you've kind of got this institutional perspective that you're coming from a business side. You've got preconceived ideas that are very deeply baked inside the things that we've been taught that need to be relearned and reconsidered, I think. And so I think the people that have done the work in this room are actually true experts in this, because they've come to understand, I think, but we've still got work to do to make sure that that's translated and received in the right way. And that even though the document's been made quite simple, I think taking it and actually doing it properly does require, and that's back to my previous question of should this be a profession? I think it absolutely has to be for those reasons, right? I think it's bedded in the organization and probably across more people than some professions might need to be as well. So we've got to make it accessible. And maybe that leads into my final question is, like, aside from the professionalization of this standard, and we've got, you mentioned earlier, like AI maybe helping to us accelerate this. Like, what do you think's next for the field of innovation, and what gives you hope and excitement about the future of this, rather than maybe some of the nervousness and fear, particularly with AI?
AI is a fabulous tool, and good innovation is about knowing how to ask the right questions, and that's the job for us as the humans to start to become better at. And that's, for me, is really interesting, because there's a behavior change that has to happen with us. That we kind of go, well, how is AI going to develop? I'm more interested in how we're going to develop, because our current workforce have been told not to ask questions, have been told, kind of do your job. Don't think outside the box. Be really efficient. Stick within your lane, and you'll be fine. You'll be able to bring home a paycheck, and that's what's being asked of you. And then we also develop these areas of expertise, and nobody questions that. But AI is fantastic, because you can now question everything and get information about that. I often say that AI is more, AO, it's aggregated opinion as opposed to artificial intelligence, but it's an aggregated opinion that can help to inform your question. And innovating is all about learning. It's all about asking questions and asking better and better questions, and managing those uncertainties, getting those answers down. So for me, it's a huge enabler of the behavior change that we need to take basically 30 years of staff through, because we need people to go from being very much about being efficient and knowledgeable and expert to being comfortable with ambiguity, to being able to look at very disparate data, to be able to ask, kind of difficult questions, don't have assumptions, challenge assumptions, all of these things. And in 56001, we start with leadership first, and then the next thing is behavior change. It's leadership and behavior change, and your culture and communication. So what's really exciting is, as we professionalize this, as we start to take innovation seriously as a lever of optimization within an organization's capabilities. Okay. And that's really what's happening with professionalization and with the standard. That's where we're putting it. When you start to understand that, that's when we start to see the right kind of leadership, the right kind of leadership thinking. And that's where we can then affect that behavior change along with AI. And we can start to do incredible things, because we have a huge amount of knowledge that we can draw from these disparate data sets that we never had before, to make these changes. So I'm very excited about what more structure is going to help to bring, along with this huge proliferation of data that we have through the likes of AI. And the third piece, so structure, the standards, AI, this proliferation of data, and then we've got the behavior change, the right leadership, the ability to give people back their right to creativity, their right to freedom of thought, their right to exploration and experimentation, because everybody deserves to have that right. And so many of us lost that through our education, through, the way that we expect people to behave, through social norming, through that constructivism. We've said, no, you can't do that. Socially, it's unacceptable for you to do that. We can now actually start to give people back their freedom of creativity, which I think is a very important one. But I've covered so much. I hope that
you've covered a lot, and I feel like I had more questions, but that was such a nice way to end that maybe that's where we should end this episode. Just quickly for listeners who want to know more about you and your work at Verity Merit and the standards and stuff, maybe just talk a little bit about the work that you're doing there and how people can find you.
Yes, so we're responsible for training around the standards and helping to embed them, looking at the kind of competencies that you need within your organization and helping with that kind of behavior change. So we support organizations, like I mentioned, the NHS, in the training and implementation of the standard. And that's come from a background of innovation management, consulting for the last 8 or 9 years. But we're also spreading the good word. So if you want to know more, if you want to be part of the conversation around how we start to professionalize innovation management within the UK, how we create this collective body of knowledge, how we move all of these parts forward, and how, if you've got excited about this balance ball and kind of how to get this right and starting to see what this really looks like and the architecture and the system, and kind of you've taken the red pill and you can see the matrix, and you want to come and play with us, then get in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. And Victoria, thank you. It has been a really good conversation, and I know that you've got such a depth of body of knowledge yourself on this now, and been sat in so many meetings we could talk for days on it. But I think this has been a good grounded conversation. I've actually learned a few things through this that I hadn't necessarily processed in many of the conversations as well. And I think it's a great opportunity and a good call to action to folk that want to seize the opportunity to be right at the front, the cold face of building this profession out. Right, that doesn't happen very often. And so, yeah, if you're interested, then get in touch with Victoria. Victoria, thank you very, very much for this. As always, everybody, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to give us feedback, to let us know, and hit subscribe, share with others, and leave us a review. And we'll be back very soon with more conversations on how to unlock total innovation. Thank you.